The Red Pyramid. Chapter 1. A Death at the Needle. We only have a few hours, so listen carefully. If you're hearing this story, you're already in danger. Sadie and I might be your only chance. Go to the school. Find the locker. I won't tell you which school or which locker, because if you're the right person, you'll find it. The combination is 13, 32, 33. By the time you finish listening, you'll know what those numbers mean. Just remember, the story we're about to tell you isn't complete yet. How it ends will depend on you. The most important thing, when you open the package and find what's inside, don't keep it longer than a week. Sure, it'll be tempting. It will grant you almost unlimited power. But if you possess it too long, it will consume you. Learn its secrets quickly and pass it on. Hide it for the next person, the way Sadie and I did for you. Then be prepared for your life to get very interesting. Okay, Sadie is telling me to stop stalling and get on with the story. Fine. I guess it started in London the night our dad blew up the British Museum. My name is Carter Kane. I'm 14 and my home is a suitcase. You think I'm kidding? Since I was 8 years old, my dad and I have traveled the world. I was born in LA, but my dad's an archaeologist, so his work takes him all over. Mostly we go to Egypt, since that's his specialty. Go into a bookstore, find a book about Egypt. There's a pretty good chance it was written by Dr. Julius Cain. You want to know how Egyptians pulled the brains out of mummies, or built the pyramids, or cursed King Tut's tomb? My dad is your man. Of course, there are other reasons my dad moved around so much, but I didn't know his secret back then. I didn't go to school. My dad homeschooled me. If you can call it homeschooling when you don't have a home. He sort of taught me whatever he thought was important, so I learned a lot about Egypt and basketball stats and my dad's favorite musicians. I read a lot, too. Pretty much anything I could get my hands on, from my dad's history books to fantasy novels, because I spent a lot of time sitting around in hotels and airports and dig sites in foreign countries where I didn't know anybody. My dad was always telling me to put the book down and play some ball. You ever try to start a game of pickup basketball in Aswan, Egypt? It's not easy. Anyway, my dad trained me early to keep all my possessions in a single suitcase that fits in an airplane's overhead compartment. My dad packed the same way, except he was allowed an extra work bag for his archaeology tools. Rule number 1, I was not allowed to look in his work bag. That's a rule I never broke until the day of the explosion. It happened on Christmas Eve. We were in London for visitation day with my sister, Sadie. See, Dad's only allowed 2 days a year with her. One in the winter, one in the summer, because our grandparents hate him. After our mom died, her parents, our grandparents, had this big court battle with Dad. After 6 lawyers, 2 fistfights, and a near-fatal attack with a spatula, don't ask, they won the right to keep Sadie with them in England. She was only 6, 2 years younger than me, and they couldn't keep us both. At least that was their excuse for not taking me. So Sadie was raised as a British school kid, and I traveled around with my dad. We only saw Sadie twice a year, which was fine with me. Shut up, Sadie. Yes, I'm getting to that part. So anyway, my dad and I had just flown into Heathrow after a couple of delays. It was a drizzly cold afternoon. The whole taxi ride into the city, my dad seemed kind of nervous. Now, my dad is a big guy. He wouldn't think anything could make him nervous. He has dark brown skin like mine, piercing brown eyes, a bald head, and a goatee, so he looks like a buff evil scientist. That afternoon he wore his cashmere winter coat and his best brown suit, the one he used for public lectures. Usually he exudes so much confidence that he dominates any room he walks into. But sometimes, like that afternoon, I saw another side to him that I didn't really understand. He kept looking over his shoulder like we were being hunted. "Dad, I asked as we were getting off the A40. What's wrong? No sign of them, he muttered. Then he must have realized he'd spoken aloud because he looked at me kind of startled. Nothing, Carter. Everything's fine. Which bothered me because my dad's a terrible liar. I always knew when he was hiding something, but I also knew no amount of pestering would get the truth out of him. He was probably trying to protect me, though from what I didn't know. Sometimes I wondered if he had some dark secret in his past. Some old enemies following him, maybe? But the idea seemed ridiculous. Dad was just an archaeologist. The other thing that troubled me, Dad was clutching his work bag. Usually when he does that, it means we're in danger. Like the time gunmen stormed our hotel in Cairo. I heard shots coming from the lobby and ran downstairs to check on my dad. By the time I got there, he was just calmly zipping up his work bag while 3 unconscious gunmen hung from their feet from the chandelier, their robes falling over their heads so you could see their boxer shorts. Dad claimed not to have witnessed anything, and in the end the policeman blamed a freak chandelier malfunction. Another time we got caught in a riot in Paris. My dad found the nearest parked car, pushed me into the back seat, and told me to stay put. I pressed myself against his floorboards and kept my eyes shut real tight. I could hear Dad in the driver's seat, rummaging in his bag, mumbling something to himself, while the mob yelled and destroyed things outside. A few minutes later, he told me it was safe to get up. Every other car on the block had been overturned and set on fire. Our car had been freshly washed and polished, and several 20-euro notes had been tucked under the windshield wipers. Anyway, I'd come to respect the bag. It was our good luck charm. But when my dad kept it close, it meant we were going to need good luck. We drove to the city center, heading east toward my grandparents' flat. We passed the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, the big stone column at Trafalgar Square. London is a pretty cool place, but after you've traveled for so long, all cities start to blend together. Other kids I meet sometimes say, "Wow, you're so lucky you get to travel so much." But it's not like we spend our time sightseeing or have a lot of money to travel in style. We've stayed in some pretty rough places, and we hardly ever stay anywhere longer than a few days. Most of the time, it feels like we're fugitives rather than tourists. I mean, you wouldn't think my dad's work was dangerous. He does lectures on topics like, "Can Egyptian magic really kill you?" and "Favorite punishments in the Egyptian underworld," and other stuff most people wouldn't care about. But like I said, that's the other side to him. He's always very cautious, checking every hotel room before he lets me walk into it. He'll dart into a museum to see some artifacts, take a few notes, and rush out again like he's afraid to be caught on the security cameras. One time when I was younger, we raced across the Charles de Gaulle airport to catch a last-minute flight, and Dad didn't relax until the plane was off the ground. I asked him point blank what he was running from, and he looked at me like I just pulled the pin out of a grenade. For a second, I was scared he might actually tell me the truth. Then he said, "Carter, it's nothing," as if nothing were the most terrible thing in the world. After that, I decided maybe it was better not to ask questions. My grandparents, the Fausts, live in a housing development near Canary Wharf, right on the banks of the River Thames. The taxi let us off at the curb, and my dad asked the driver to wait. We were halfway up the walk when Dad froze. He turned and looked behind us. "What?" I asked. Then I saw the man in the trench coat. He was across the street, leaning against a big dead tree. He was barrel-shaped, with skin the color of roasted coffee. His coat and black pinstripe suit looked expensive. He had long braided hair and wore a black fedora pulled down low over his dark, round glasses. He reminded me of a jazz musician, the kind my dad would always drag me to see in concert. Even though I couldn't see his eyes, I got the impression he was watching us. He might have been an old friend or colleague of Dad's. No matter where we went, Dad was always running into people he knew. But it did seem strange that the guy was waiting here, outside my grandparents', and he didn't look happy. "Carter," my dad said, "go on ahead. But get your sister. I'll meet you back at the taxi." He crossed the street towards the man in the trench coat, which left me with two choices: follow my dad and see what was going on, or do what I was told. I decided on the slightly less dangerous path. I went to retrieve my sister. Before I could even knock, Sadie opened the door. "Late as usual," she said. She was holding her cat Muffin, who'd been a going-away gift from Dad 6 years before. Muffin never seemed to get older or bigger. She had fuzzy yellow and black fur like a miniature leopard, alert yellow eyes, and pointy ears that were too tall for her head. A silver Egyptian pendant dangled from her collar. She didn't look anything like a muffin, but Sadie had been little when she named her, so I guess you have to cut her some slack. Sadie hadn't changed much either since last summer. As I'm recording this, she's standing next to me glaring, so I better be careful how I describe her. You would never guess she's my sister. First of all, she'd been living in England so long she had a British accent. Second, she takes after our mom, who was white, so Sadie's skin is much lighter than mine. She has straight caramel-colored hair, not exactly blonde but not brown, which she usually dyes with streaks of bright colors. That day it had red streaks down the left side. Her eyes are blue. I'm serious. Blue eyes. Just like our mom's. She's only 12, but she's exactly as tall as me, which is really annoying. She was chewing gum, as usual, dressed for her day out with Dad in battered jeans, a leather jacket, and combat boots, like she was going to a concert and was hoping to stomp on some people. She had headphones dangling around her neck, in case we bored her. Okay, she didn't hit me, so I guess I did an okay job of describing her. Our plane was late, I told her. She popped a bubble, rubbed Muffin's head, and tossed the cat inside. "Gran, going out?" From somewhere in the house, Grandma Foss said something I couldn't make out, probably, "Don't let them in." Sadie closed the door and regarded me as if I were a dead mouse her cat had just dragged in. "So here you are again." "Yep." "Come on then," she sighed. "Let's get on with it." That's the way she was. No, "Hi, how have you been the last 6 months? So glad to see you," or anything. But that was okay with me. When you see each other only twice a year, it's like you're distant cousins rather than siblings. We had absolutely nothing in common except our parents. We trudged down the steps. I was thinking how she smelled like a combination of old people's house and bubble gum when she stopped so abruptly I ran into her. "Who's that?" she asked. I'd almost forgotten about the dude in the trench coat. He and my dad were standing across the street next to the big tree, having what looked like a serious argument. Dad's back was turned, so I couldn't see his face, but he gestured with his hands like he does when he's agitated. The other guy scowled and shook his head. "Dunno," I said. "He was there when we pulled up." "He looks familiar." Sadie frowned like she was trying to remember. "Come on." "Dad wants us to wait in the cab," I said, even though I knew it was no use. Sadie was already on the move. Instead of going straight across the street, she dashed up the sidewalk for half a block, ducking behind cars, then crossed to the opposite side and crouched down under a low stone wall. She started sneaking towards our dad. I didn't have much choice but to follow her example, even though it made me feel kind of stupid. 6 years in England, I muttered, and she thinks she's James Bond. Sadie swatted me without looking back, and I kept creeping forward. A couple more steps, and we were right behind the big dead tree. I could hear my dad on the other side saying, "Have to, Amos. You know it's the right thing." "No," said the other man, who must have been Amos. His voice was deep and even, very insistent. His accent was American. "If I don't stop you, Julius, they will. The per-unk is shadowing you." Sadie turned to me and mouthed the words, "Per what?" I shook my head, just as mystified. "Let's get out of here," I whispered, because I figured we'd be spotted any minute and get in serious trouble. Sadie, of course, ignored me. "They don't know my plan," my father was saying. "By the time they figure it out..." "And the children?" Amos asked. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. "What about them?" "I've made arrangements to protect them," my dad said. "Besides, if I don't do this, we're all in danger. Now back off." "I can't, Julius." "Then it's a duel you want?" Dad's tone turned deadly serious. "You could never beat me, Amos." I hadn't seen my dad get violent since the great spatula incident, and I wasn't anxious to see a repeat of that, but the two men seemed to be edging towards a fight. Before I could react, Sadie popped up and shouted, "Dad!" He looked surprised when she tackle-hugged him, but not nearly as surprised as the other guy, Amos. He backed up so quickly he tripped over his own trench coat. He'd taken off his glasses. I couldn't help thinking that Sadie was right. He did look familiar, like a very distant memory. I must be going," he said. He straightened his fedora and lumbered down the road. Our dad watched him go. He kept one arm protectively around Sadie and one hand inside the work bag slung over his shoulder. Finally, when Amos disappeared around the corner, Dad relaxed. He took his hand out of the bag and smiled at Sadie. "Hello, sweetheart." Sadie pushed away from him and crossed her arms. "Oh, now it's sweetheart, is it? You're late. Visitation day's nearly over. What's that about? Who's Amos? And what's the per-unk?" Dad stiffened. He glanced at me like he was wondering how much we'd overheard. "It's nothing," he said, trying to sound upbeat. "I have a wonderful evening planned. Who'd like a private tour of the British Museum?" Sadie slumped in the back of the taxi between Dad and me. "I can't believe it," she grumbled. "One evening together and you want to do research." Dad tried for a smile. "Sweetheart, it'll be fun. The curator of the Egyptian collection personally invited..." "Right, big surprise." Sadie blew a strand of red-streaked hair out of her face. "Christmas Eve, and we're going to see some old moldy relics from Egypt. Do you ever think about anything else?" Dad didn't get mad. He never gets mad at Sadie. He just stared out the window at the darkening sky and the rain. "Yes," he said quietly, "I do." Whenever Dad got quiet like that and stared off into nowhere, I knew he was thinking about our mom. The last few months, it had been happening a lot. I'd walk into our hotel room and find him with his cell phone in his hands, Mom's picture smiling up at him from the screen. Her hair tucked under a headscarf, her blue eyes startlingly bright against the desert backdrop. Or we'd be at some dig site. I'd see Dad staring at the horizon, and I'd know he was remembering how he'd met her. Two young scientists in the Valley of the Kings, on a dig to discover a lost tomb. Dad was an archaeologist. Mom was an anthropologist looking for ancient DNA. He told me the story 1,000 times. Our taxi snaked its way along the banks of the Thames. Just past Waterloo Bridge, my dad tensed. "Driver," he said, "stop here a moment." The cabbie pulled over on the Victoria Embankment. "What is it, Dad?" I asked. He got out of the cab like he hadn't heard me. When Sadie and I joined him on the sidewalk, he was staring up at Cleopatra's Needle. In case you've never seen it, the needle is an obelisk, not a needle, and it doesn't have anything to do with Cleopatra. I guess the British just thought the name sounded cool when they brought it to London. It's about 70 feet tall, which would have been really impressive back in ancient Egypt. But on the Thames, with all the tall buildings around, it looks small and sad. You could drive right by it and not even realize you'd just passed something that was 1,000 years older than the city of London. God. Sadie walked around in a frustrated circle. Do we have to stop for every monument? My dad stared at the top of the obelisk. I had to see it again, he murmured, where it happened. A freezing wind blew off the river. I wanted to get back in the cab, but my dad was really starting to worry me. I'd never seen him so distracted. What, Dad? I asked. What happened here? The last place I saw her. Sadie stopped pacing. She scowled at me uncertainly, then back at Dad. Hang on. Do you mean Mum? Dad brushed Sadie's hair behind her ear, and she was so surprised she didn't even push him away. I felt like the rain had frozen me solid. Mom's death had always been a forbidden subject. I knew she died in an accident in London. I knew my grandparents blamed my dad, but no one would ever tell us the details. I'd given up asking my dad, partially because it made him so sad, partially because he absolutely refused to tell me anything. When you're older, was all he would say, which was the most frustrating response ever. You're telling us she died here? I said. At Cleopatra's Needle? What happened? He lowered his head. Dad, Sadie protested. I go past this every day, and you mean to say all this time, and I didn't even know? Do you still have your cat? Dad asked her, which seemed like a really stupid question. Of course I've still got the cat, she said. What does that have to do with anything? And your amulet? Sadie's hand went to her neck. When we were little, right before Sadie went to live with our grandparents, Dad had given us both Egyptian amulets. Mine was an Eye of Horus, which is a popular protection symbol in ancient Egypt. In fact, my dad says the modern pharmacist symbol, RX, is a simplified version of the Eye of Horus because medicine is supposed to protect you. Anyway, I always wore my amulet under my shirt, but I figure Sadie would have lost hers or thrown it away. To my surprise, she nodded. Of course I have it, Dad. But don't change the subject. Grant's always going on about how you caused Mum's death. That's not true, is it? We waited. For once, Sadie and I wanted exactly the same thing. The truth. The night your mother died, my father started, here at the Needle. A sudden flash illuminated the embankment. I turned, half blind, and just for a moment, I glimpsed two figures. A tall, pale man with a forked beard, wearing a cream-colored robe, and a coppery-skinned girl in dark blue robes and a headscarf. The kind of clothes I'd seen hundreds of times in Egypt. They were just standing there, side by side, not 20 feet away, watching us. Then the light faded. The figures melted into a fuzzy afterimage. When my eyes readjusted to the darkness, they were gone. Sadie said nervously. Did you just see that? Get in the cab, my dad said, pushing us towards the curb. We're out of time. From that point on, Dad clammed up. This isn't the place to talk, he said, glancing behind us. He'd promised the cabbie an extra £10 if he got us to the museum in under 5 minutes, and the cabbie was doing his best. Dad, I tried, those people at the river. And the other bloke, Amos, Sadie said. Are they Egyptian police or something? Look, both of you, Dad said. I'm going to need your help tonight. I know it's hard, but you have to be patient. I'll explain everything, I promise, after we get to the museum. I'm going to make everything right again." "What do you mean?" Sadie insisted. "Make what right?" Dad's expression was more than sad. It was almost guilty. With a chill, I thought about what Sadie had said, about our grandparents blaming him for Mom's death. That couldn't be what he was talking about, could it? The cabbie swerved onto Great Russell Street and screeched to a halt in front of the museum's main gates. "Just follow my lead," Dad told us. "When we meet the curator, act normal." I was thinking that Sadie never acted normal, but I decided not to say anything. We climbed out of the cab. I got our luggage while Dad paid the driver with a big wad of cash. Then he did something strange. He threw a handful of small objects into the back seat. They looked like stones, but it was too dark for me to be sure. "Keep driving," he told the cabbie. "Take us to Chelsea." That made no sense, since we were already out of the cab, but the driver sped off. I glanced at Dad, then back at the cab, and before it turned the corner and disappeared into the dark, I caught a weird glimpse of 3 passengers in the back seat, a man and 2 kids. I blinked. There was no way the cab could have picked up another fare so fast. "Dad?" "London cabs don't stay empty very long," he said matter-of-factly. "Come along, kids." We marched off through the wrought iron gates. For a second, Sadie and I hesitated. "Carter, what is going on?" I shook my head. "I'm not sure I want to know." "We'll stay out here in the cold if you want, but I'm not leaving without an explanation." She turned and marched after our dad. Looking back on it, I should have run. I should have dragged Sadie out of there and gotten as far away as possible. Instead, I followed her through the gates. Chapter 2. An Explosion for Christmas. I'd been to the British Museum before. In fact, I've been to more museums than I'd like to admit. Makes me sound like a total geek. That's Sadie in the background yelling that I am a total geek. "Thanks, sis." Anyway, the museum was closed and completely dark, but the curator and 2 security guards were waiting for us on the front steps. "Mr. Kane!" The curator was a greasy little dude in a cheap suit. I'd see mummies with more hair and teeth. He shook my dad's hand like he was meeting a rock star. "Your last paper on Imhotep. Brilliant. I don't know how you translated those spells." "Imo who?" Sadie muttered to me. "Imhotep," I said. "High priest, architect. Some say he was a magician. Designed the first step pyramid. You know." "Don't know," Sadie said. "Don't care, but thanks." Dad expressed his gratitude to the curator for hosting us on a holiday. Then he put his hand on my shoulder. "Dr. Martin, I'd like you to meet Carter and Sadie." "Ah, your son, obviously, and..." The curator looked hesitantly at Sadie. "And this young lady?" "My daughter," Dad said. Dr. Martin's stare went temporarily blank. Doesn't matter how open-minded or polite people think they are, there's always that moment of confusion that flashes across their faces when they realize Sadie is a part of our family. I hate it, but over the years I've come to accept it. The curator regained a smile. Yes, of course. Right this way, Dr. Kane. We're very honored." The security guards locked the doors behind us. They took our luggage. Then one of them reached for Dad's work bag. "Ah, no," Dad said with a tight smile. "I'll keep this one." The guards stayed in the foyer as we followed the curator into the great court. It was ominous at night. Dim light from the glass-domed ceiling cast cross-hatched shadows across the walls like a giant spider web. Our footsteps clicked on the white marble floor. "So," Dad said, "the stone." "Yes," the curator said, "though I can't imagine what new information you could glean from it. It's been studied to death. Our most famous artifact, of course. Of course, Dad said, but you may be surprised. What's he on about now? Sadie whispered to me. I didn't answer. I had a sneaking suspicion what stone they were talking about, but I couldn't figure out why Dad would drag us out to see it on Christmas Eve. I wondered what he'd been about to tell us at Cleopatra's Needle. Something about our mother and the night she died. And why did he keep glancing around as if he expected those strange people we'd seen at the Needle to pop up again? We were locked in a museum surrounded by guards and high-tech security. Nobody could bother us in here, I hoped. We turned left into the Egyptian wing. The walls were lined with massive statues of the pharaohs and gods, but my dad bypassed them all and went straight for the main attraction in the middle of the room. Beautiful, my dad murmured. And it's not a replica? No, the curator promised. We don't always keep the actual stone on display, but for you, this is quite real. We were staring at a slab of dark gray rock about 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide. It sat on a pedestal encased in a glass box. The flat surface of the stone was chiseled with 3 distinct bands of writing. The top part was ancient Egyptian picture writing, hieroglyphics. The middle section, I had to rack my brain to remember what my dad had called it. Demotic? A kind of writing from the period when the Greeks controlled Egypt, and a lot of Greek words got mixed into Egyptian. The last lines were in Greek. The Rosetta Stone, I said. Isn't that a computer program? Sadie asked. I wanted to tell her how stupid she was, but the curator cut me off with a nervous laugh. Young lady, the Rosetta Stone was the key to deciphering hieroglyphics. It was discovered by Napoleon's army in 1799 and... Oh, right, Sadie said. I remember now. I knew she was just saying that to shut him up, but my dad wouldn't let it go. Sadie, he said, until the stone was discovered, regular mortals, no one had been able to read hieroglyphics for centuries. The written language of Egypt had been completely forgotten. Then an Englishman named Thomas Young proved that the Rosetta Stone's 3 languages all conveyed the same message. A Frenchman named Champollion took up the work and cracked the code of hieroglyphics. Sadie chewed her gum, unimpressed. What's it say, then? Dad shrugged. Nothing important. It's basically a thank you letter from some priest to King Ptolemy V. When it was first carved, the stone was no big deal. But over the centuries, it has become a powerful symbol, perhaps the most important connection between ancient Egypt and the modern world. I was a fool not to realize its potential sooner. He'd lost me, and apparently the curator, too. Dr. Kane? He asked. Are you quite all right? Dad breathed deeply. My apologies, Dr. Martin. I was just thinking aloud. If I could have the glass removed, and if you could bring me the papers I asked for from your archives. Dr. Martin nodded. He pressed a code into a small remote control, and the front of the glass box clicked open. It will take a few minutes to retrieve the notes, Dr. Martin said. For someone else, I would hesitate to grant unguarded access to the stone, as you've requested. I trust you'll be careful. He glanced at us kids like we were troublemakers. We'll be careful, Dad promised. As soon as Dr. Martin's steps receded, Dad turned to us with a frantic look in his eyes. Children, this is very important. You have to stay out of this room. He slipped his work bag off his shoulder and unzipped it just enough to pull out a bike chain and padlock. Follow Dr. Martin. You'll find his office at the end of the great court on the left. There's only one entrance. Once he's inside, wrap this around the door handle and lock it tight. We need to delay him. You want us to lock him in? Sadie asked, suddenly interested. Brilliant. Dad, I said, what's going on? We don't have time for explanations, he said. This will be our only chance. They're coming. Who's coming? Sadie asked. He took Sadie by the shoulders. Sweetheart, I love you, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for many things, but there's no time now. If this works, I promise I'll make everything better for all of us. Carter, you're my brave man. You have to trust me. Remember, lock up Dr. Martin, then stay out of this room. Chaining the curator's door was easy, but as soon as we'd finished, we looked back the way we'd come and saw blue light streaming from the Egyptian gallery, as if our dad had installed a giant glowing aquarium. Sadie locked eyes with me. Honestly, do you have any idea what he's up to? None, I said, but he's been acting strange lately, thinking a lot about Mom. He keeps her picture. I didn't want to say more. Fortunately, Sadie nodded like she understood. What's in his work bag? She asked. I don't know. He told me never to look. Sadie raised an eyebrow. And you never did? God, that is so like you, Carter. You're hopeless. I wanted to defend myself, but just then a tremor shook the floor. Startled, Sadie grabbed my arm. He told us to stay put. I suppose you're going to follow that order, too. Actually, that order was sounding pretty good to me, but Sadie sprinted down the hall, and after a moment's hesitation, I ran after her. When we reached the entrance of the Egyptian gallery, we stopped dead in our tracks. Our dad stood in front of the Rosetta Stone with his back to us. A blue circle glowed on the floor around him, as if someone had switched on hidden neon tubes in the floor. My dad had thrown off his overcoat. His work bag lay open at his feet, revealing a wooden box about 2 feet long, painted with Egyptian images. What's he holding? Sadie whispered to me. Is that a boomerang? Sure enough, when Dad raised his hand, he was brandishing a carved white stick. It did look like a boomerang, but instead of throwing the stick, he touched it to the Rosetta Stone. Sadie caught her breath. Dad was writing on the stone. Whenever the boomerang made contact, glowing blue lines appeared on the granite. Hieroglyphs. It made no sense. How could he write glowing words with a stick? But the image was bright and clear. Ram's horns above a box and an X. Open, Sadie murmured. I stared at her, because it sounded like she had just translated the word. But that was impossible. I'd been hanging around Dad for years, and even I could read only a few hieroglyphs. They are seriously hard to learn. Dad raised his arm. He chanted, Wo Sir Aye, and 2 more hieroglyphic symbols burned blue against the surface of the Rosetta Stone. As stunned as I was, I recognized the first symbol. It was the name of the Egyptian god of the dead. Wo Sir, I whispered. I'd never heard it pronounced that way, but I knew what it meant. Osiris. Osiris, come, Sadie said, as if in a trance. Then her eyes widened. No, she shouted. Dad, no! Our father turned in surprise. He started to say, children, but it was too late. The ground rumbled. The blue light turned to searing white, and the Rosetta Stone exploded. When I regained consciousness, the first thing I heard was laughter. Horrible, gleeful laughter mixed with the blare of the museum's security alarms. I felt like I'd just been run over by a tractor. I sat up, dazed, and spit a piece of the Rosetta Stone out of my mouth. The gallery was in ruins. Waves of fire rippled in pools along the floor. Giant statues had toppled. Sarcophagi had been knocked off their pedestals. Pieces of the Rosetta Stone had exploded outward with such force that they'd embedded themselves in the columns, the walls, the other exhibits. Sadie was passed out next to me, but she looked unharmed. I shook her shoulder and she grunted, "Ugh." In front of us, where the Rosetta Stone had been, stood a smoking, sheared-off pedestal. The floor was blackened in a starburst pattern, except for the glowing blue circle around our father. He was facing our direction, but he didn't seem to be looking at us. A bloody cut ran across his scalp. He gripped the boomerang tightly. I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then the horrible laughter echoed around the room again, and I realized it was coming from right in front of me. Something stood between our father and us. At first, I could barely make it out, just a flicker of heat. But as I concentrated, it took on a vague form, the fiery outline of a man. He was taller than Dad, and his laugh cut through me like a chainsaw. "Well done," he said to my father. "Very well done, Julius." "You were not summoned." My father's voice trembled. He held up the boomerang, but the fiery man flicked one finger, and the stick flew from Dad's hand, shattering against the wall. "I am never summoned, Julius," the man purred. "But when you open a door, you must be prepared for guests to walk through." "Back to the duat," my father roared. "I have the power of the great king." "Ooh, scary," the fiery man said with amusement. "And even if you knew how to use that power, which you do not, he was never my match. I am the strongest. Now you will share his fate." I couldn't make sense of anything, but I knew that I had to help my dad. I tried to pick up the nearest chunk of stone, but I was so terrified my fingers felt frozen and numb. My hands were useless. My dad shot me a silent look of warning. "Get out." I realized he was intentionally keeping the fiery man's back to us, hoping Sadie and I would escape unnoticed. Sadie was still groggy. I managed to drag her behind a column, into the shadows. When she started to protest, I clamped my hand over her mouth. That woke her up. She saw what was happening and stopped fighting. Alarms blared, fire circled around the doorway of the gallery. The guards had to be on their way, but I wasn't sure if that was a good thing for us. Dad crouched to the floor, keeping his eyes on his enemy, and opened his painted wooden box. He brought out a small rod like a ruler. He muttered something under his breath, and the rod elongated into a wooden staff as tall as he was. Sadie made a squeaking sound. I couldn't believe my eyes either, but things only got weirder. Dad threw his staff at the fiery man's feet, and it changed into an enormous serpent, 10 feet long and as big around as I was, with coppery scales and glowing red eyes. It lunged at the fiery man, who effortlessly grabbed the serpent by its neck. The man's hand burst into white-hot flames, and the snake burned to ashes. "An old trick, Julius," the fiery man chided. My dad glanced at us, silently urging us again to run. Part of me refused to believe any of this was real. Maybe I was unconscious, having a nightmare. Next to me, Sadie picked up a chunk of stone. "How many?" my dad asked quickly, trying to keep the fiery man's attention. "How many did I release?" "Why, all 5," the man said, as if he were explaining something to a child. "You should know we're a package deal, Julius. Soon I'll release even more, and they'll be very grateful. I shall be named king again." "The demon days," my father said. "They'll stop you before it's too late." The fiery man laughed. "You think the house can stop me? Those old fools can't even stop arguing among themselves. Let the story be told anew, and this time you shall never rise." The fiery man waved his hand. The blue circle at Dad's feet went dark. Dad grabbed for his toolbox, but it skirted across the floor. "Goodbye, Osiris," the fireman said. With another flick of his hand, he conjured a glowing coffin around my dad. At first it was transparent, but as our father struggled and pounded on its sides, the coffin became more and more solid. A golden Egyptian sarcophagus inlaid with jewels. My dad caught my eyes one last time and mouthed the word, "Run," before the coffin sank into the floor as if the ground had turned it to water. "Dad!" I screamed. Sadie threw her stone, but it sailed harmlessly through the fireman's head. He turned, and for one terrible moment his face appeared in the flames. What I saw made no sense. It was as if someone had superimposed two different faces on top of each other. One almost human, with pale skin, cruel, angular features, and glowing red eyes. The other like an animal, with dark fur and sharp fangs. Worse than a dog or a wolf or a lion, some animal I'd never seen before. Those red eyes stared at me, and I knew I was going to die. Behind me, heavy footsteps echoed on the marble floor of the great court. Voices were barking orders. The security guards, maybe the police, but they'd never get here in time. The fiery man lunged at us. A few inches from my face, something shoved him back. The air sparked with electricity. The amulet around my neck grew uncomfortably hot. The fiery man hissed, regarding me more carefully. "So, it's you." The building shook again. At the opposite end of the room, part of the wall exploded into a brilliant flash of light. Two people stepped through the gap. The man and the girl we'd seen at the Needle, their robes swirling around them. Both of them held staffs. The fiery man snarled. He looked at me one last time and said, "Soon, boy." Then the entire room erupted in flames. A blast of heat sucked all the air out of my lungs, and I crumpled to the floor. The last thing I remember, the man with the forked beard and the girl in blue were standing over me. I heard the security guards running and shouting, getting closer. The girl crouched over me and drew a long, curved knife from her belt. "We must act quickly," she told the man. "Not yet," he said with some reluctance. His thick accent sounded French. "We must be sure before we destroy them." I closed my eyes and drifted into unconsciousness. Chapter 3. Imprisoned with my cat. Give me the bloody mic. Hello, Sadie here, my brother's rubbish storyteller. Sorry about that. But now you've got me, so all is well. Let's see. The explosion. Rosetta Stone in a billion pieces. Fiery evil bloke. Dad boxed in a coffin. Creepy Frenchman and Arab girl with a knife. Us passing out. Right. So when I woke up, the police were rushing about, as you might expect. They separated me from my brother. I didn't really mind that part. He's a pain anyway. But they locked me in the curator's office for ages. And yes, they used our bicycle chain to do it. I was shattered, of course. I'd just been knocked out by a fiery whatever it was. I'd watched my dad get packed into a sarcophagus and shot through the floor. I tried to tell the police about all that, but did they care? No. Worst of all, I had a lingering chill, as if someone was pushing ice-cold needles in the back of my neck. It had started when I looked at those blue glowing words Dad had drawn on the Rosetta Stone, and I knew what they meant. A family disease, perhaps? Can knowledge of boring Egyptian stuff be hereditary? With my luck. Long after my gum had gone stale, a policewoman finally retrieved me from the curator's office. She asked me no questions. She just trundled me into a police car and took me home. Even then, I wasn't allowed to explain to Gran and Gramps. The policewoman just tossed me into my room and waited. and I waited. I don't like waiting. I paced the floor. My room was nothing posh, just an attic space with a window and a bed and a desk. There wasn't much to do. Muffin sniffed my legs and her tail puffed up like a bottle brush. I suppose she doesn't fancy the smell of museums. She hissed and disappeared under the bed. Thanks a lot, I muttered. I opened the door, but the policewoman was standing guard. The inspector will be with you in a moment, she told me. Please stay inside. I could see downstairs, just a glimpse of Gramps pacing the room, wringing his hands, while Carter and a police inspector talked on the sofa. I couldn't make out what they were saying. Could I just use the loo? I asked the nice officer. No. She closed the door in my face, as if I might rig an explosion in the toilet. Honestly. I dug out my iPad and scrolled through my playlist. Nothing struck me. I threw it on my bed in disgust. When I'm too distracted from music, that is a very sad thing. I wondered why Carter got to talk to the police first. It wasn't fair. I fiddled with the necklace Dad had given me. I'd never been sure what the symbol meant. Carter's was obviously an eye, but mine looked a bit like an angel, or perhaps a killer alien robot. Why on earth had Dad asked if I still had it? Of course I still had it. It was the only gift he'd ever given me. Well, apart from Muffin. With the cat's attitude, I'm not sure I would call her a proper gift. Dad had practically abandoned me at age 6, after all. The necklace was my one link to him. On good days, I would stare at it and remember him fondly. On bad days, which were much more frequent, I would fling it across the room and stomp on it and curse him for not being around, which I found quite therapeutic. But in the end, I always put it back on. At any rate, during the weirdness at the museum, and I'm not making this up, the necklace got hotter. I nearly took it off, but I couldn't help wondering if it was truly protecting me somehow. I'll make things right, Dad had said, with that guilty look he often gives me. Well, colossal fail, Dad. What had he been thinking? I wanted to believe it had been all a bad dream. The glowing hieroglyphs, the snake staff, the coffin. Things like that simply don't happen. But I knew better. I couldn't dream anything as horrifying as the fireman's face when he turned on us. Soon, boy, he told Carter, as if he intended to track us down. Just the idea made my hands tremble. I also couldn't help wondering about our stop at Cleopatra's Needle. How Dad had insisted on seeing it, as if we were stealing his courage. As if what he did at the British Museum had something to do with my mum. My eyes wandered across my room and fixed on my desk. No, I thought, not going to do it. But I walked over and opened the drawer. I shoved aside a few old mags, my stash of sweets, a stack of maths homework I'd forgotten to hand in, and a few pictures of me and my mates, Liz and Emma, trying on ridiculous hats in Camden Market. And there at the bottom of it all was the picture of Mum. Gran and Gramps had loads of pictures. They kept a shrine to Ruby in the hall cupboard. Mum's childhood artwork, her O-level results, her graduation picture from university, her favourite jewellery. It's quite mental. I was determined not to be like them, living in the past. I barely remembered Mum, after all, and nothing could change the fact she was dead. But I did keep the one picture. It was of Mum and me at our house in Los Angeles, just after I was born. She stood out on the balcony, the Pacific Ocean behind her, holding a wrinkled, pudgy lump of baby that would someday grow up to be yours truly. Baby me was not much to look at, but Mom was gorgeous, even in shorts and a tattered t-shirt. Her eyes were deep blue, her blonde hair was clipped back, her skin was perfect. Quite depressing compared to mine. People always say I look like her, but I couldn't even get the spot off my chin, much less look so mature and beautiful. Stop smirking, Carter. The photo fascinated me because I hardly remembered our lives together at all. But the main reason I kept the photo was because of the symbol on Mum's t-shirt. One of those life symbols. An unk. My dead mother wearing the symbol for life. Nothing could have been sadder. But she smiled at the camera as if she knew a secret, as if my dad and she were sharing a private joke. Something tugged at the back of my mind. That stocky man in the trench coat who'd been arguing with Dad across the street. He'd said something about per unk. Had he meant unk, as in the symbol for life? And if so, what was a per? I suppose he didn't mean pear, as in the fruit. I had an eerie feeling that I saw the words per unk written in hieroglyphs. I would know what it meant. I put down the picture of Mum. I picked up a pencil and turned over one of my old homework papers. I wondered what would happen if I tried to draw the words per unk. Would the right design just occur to me? As I touched pencil to paper, my bedroom door opened. Miss Kane? I whirled and dropped the pencil. A police inspector stood frowning in my doorway. What are you doing? Maths, I said. My ceiling was quite low, so the inspector had to stoop to come in. He wore a lint-coloured suit that matched his grey hair and his ashen face. Now then, Sadie, I'm Chief Inspector Williams. Let's have a chat, shall we? Sit down. I didn't sit, and neither did he, which must have annoyed him. It's hard to look in charge when you're hunched over like Quasimodo. Tell me everything, please, he said, from the time your father came round to get you. I already told the police at the museum. Again, if you don't mind. So I told them everything. Why not? His left eyebrow crept higher and higher as I told him the strange bits about the glowing letters and serpent staff. Well, Sadie, Inspector Williams said, you've got quite an imagination. I'm not lying, Inspector, and I think your eyebrow was trying to escape. He tried to look at his own eyebrows, then scowled. Now, Sadie, I'm sure this is very hard for you. I understand you want to protect your father's reputation, but he's gone now. You mean through the floor in a coffin? I insisted. He's not dead. Inspector Williams spread his hands. Sadie, I'm very sorry, but we must find out why he did this act of... Well, act of what? He cleared his throat uncomfortably. Your father destroyed priceless artifacts and apparently killed himself in the process. We'd very much like to know why. I stared at him. Are you saying my father's a terrorist? Are you mad? We've made calls to some of your father's associates. I understand his behavior has become erratic since your mother's death. He'd become more withdrawn and obsessive in his studies, spending more and more time in Egypt. He's a bloody Egyptologist. You should be looking for him, not asking stupid questions. Sadie, he said, and I could hear in his voice that he was resisting the urge to strangle me. Strangely, I get this a lot from adults. There are extremist groups in Egypt that object to Egyptian artifacts being kept in other countries' museums. These people might have approached your father. Perhaps in his state, your father became an easy target for them. If you've heard him mention any names... I stormed past him to the window. I was so angry I could hardly think. I refused to believe Dad was dead. No. And a terrorist? Please. Why did adults have to be so thick? They always say, tell the truth, and when you do, they don't believe you. What's the point? I stared down the dark street. Suddenly, that cold, tingly feeling got worse than ever. I focused on the dead tree where I'd met Dad earlier. Standing there now in the dim light of a street lamp, looking up at me, was the pudgy bloke in the black trench coat and round glasses and the fedora. The man Dad had called Amos. I suppose I should have felt threatened by an odd man staring up at me in the dark of night, but his expression was full of concern, and he looked so familiar. It was driving me mad that I couldn't remember why. Behind me, the inspector cleared his throat. Sadie, no one blames you for the attack on the museum. We understand you were dragged into this against your will. I turned from the window. Against my will? I chained the curator in his office. The inspector's eyebrows started to creep up again. Be that as it may, surely you didn't understand what your father meant to do. Possibly your brother was involved? I snorted. Carter, please. So you're determined to protect him as well. You consider him a proper brother, do you? I couldn't believe it. I wanted to smack his face. What's that supposed to mean? Because he doesn't look like me? The inspector blinked. I only meant... I know what you meant. Of course he's my brother. Inspector Williams held up his hands apologetically, but I was still seething. As much as Carter annoyed me, I hated it when people assumed we weren't related, or looked at my father askance when he said the three of us were a family, like we'd done something wrong. Stupid Dr. Martin at the museum. Inspector Williams. It happened every time Dad and Carter and I were together. Every bloody time. I'm sorry, Sadie, the inspector said. I only want to make sure we separate the innocent from the guilty. It would go much easier for everyone if you cooperate. Any information, anything your father said, people he might have mentioned. Amos, I blurted out just to see his reaction. He met a man named Amos. Inspector Williams sighed. Sadie, he couldn't have done. Surely you know that. We spoke with Amos not only an hour ago, on the phone from his home in New York. He isn't in New York, I insisted. He's right. I glanced out the window and Amos was gone. Bloody typical. That's not possible, I said. Exactly, the inspector said. But he was here, I exclaimed. Who is he? One of Dad's colleagues? How did you know to call him? Really, Sadie, this acting must stop. Acting? The inspector studied me for a moment, then he set his jaw as if he'd made a decision. We've already had the truth from Carter. I didn't want to upset you, but he told us everything. He understands there's no point protecting your father now. You might as well help us, and there will be no charges against you. You shouldn't lie to children, I yelled, hoping my voice carried all the way downstairs. Carter would never say a word against Dad, and neither will I. The inspector didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. He crossed his arms. I'm sorry you feel this way, Sadie. I'm afraid it's time we went downstairs to discuss consequences with your grandparents. Chapter 4. Kidnapped by a not-so-stranger. I just love family meetings. Very cozy. And with a Christmas garland round the fireplace and a nice pot of tea and a detective from Scotland Yard ready to arrest you. Carter slumped on the sofa, cradling Dad's work bag. I wondered why the police had let him keep it. It should have been evidence or something, but the inspector didn't seem to notice it at all. Carter looked awful. I mean, even worse than usual. Honestly, the boy had never been in proper school, and he dressed like a junior professor with his khaki trousers and a button-down shirt and loafers. He's not bad looking, I suppose. He's reasonably tall and fit, and his hair isn't hopeless. He's got Dad's eyes, and my mates Liz and Emma have even told me from his picture that he's hot, which I must take with a grain of salt, because A, he's my brother, and B, my mates are a bit crazed. When it came to clothes, Carter wouldn't have known hot if it bit him on the bum. Oh, don't look at me like that, Carter. You know it's true. At any rate, I shouldn't have been so hard on him. He was taking Dad's disappearance even worse than I was. Gran and Graps sat on either side of him, looking quite nervous. The pot of tea and a plate of biscuits sat on the table, but no one was having any. Chief Inspector Williams ordered me into the only free chair. Then he paced in front of the fireplace importantly. 2 more police stood by the front door, the woman from earlier and a big bloke who kept eyeing the biscuits. "Mr. and Mrs. Faust," Inspector Williams said, "I'm afraid we have 2 uncooperative children." Gran fidgeted with the trim of her dress. "It's hard to believe she's related to Mum." Gran is frail and colourless, like a stick person, really, while Mum in the photos always looked so happy and full of life. "They're just children," she managed. "Surely you can't blame them." "Bah," Graps said. "This is ridiculous, Inspector. They aren't responsible." Graps is a former rugby player. He has beefy arms, a belly much too big for his shirt, and eyes sunk deep in his face as if someone had punched them. Well, actually Dad had punched them years ago, but that's another story. Graps is quite scary looking. Usually people got out of his way, but Inspector Williams didn't seem impressed. "Mr. Faust," he said, "what do you imagine the morning headlines will read? British Museum attacked, Rosetta Stone destroyed, your son-in-law," "former son-in-law," Graps corrected, "was most likely vaporized in the explosion, or he ran off, in which case—" "He didn't run off," I shouted. "We need to know where he is," the inspector continued, "and the only witnesses, your grandchildren, refused to tell me the truth." "We did tell the truth," Carter said. "Dad isn't dead. He sank through the floor." Inspector Williams glanced at Gramps as if to say, "There, you see." Then he turned to Carter. "Young man, your father has committed a criminal act. He's left you behind to deal with the consequences." "That's not true," I snapped, my voice trembling with rage. I couldn't believe Dad would intentionally leave us at the mercy of police, of course. But the idea of him abandoning me, well, as I might have mentioned, that's a bit of a sore point. "Dear, please," Gran told me, "the inspector is only doing his job." "Badly," I said. "Let's all have some tea," Grant suggested. "No," Carter and I yelled at once, which made me feel bad for Gran, as she practically wilted into the sofa. "We can charge you," the inspector warned, turning on me. "We can and we will." He froze. Then he blinked several times as if he'd forgotten what he was doing. Gramps frowned. Inspector?" "Yes," Chief Inspector Williams murmured dreamily. He reached in his pocket and took out a little blue booklet, an American passport. He threw it in Carter's lap. "You're being deported," the inspector announced. "You're to leave the country within 24 hours. If we need to question you further, you'll be contacted through the FBI. Carter's mouth fell open. He looked at me, and I knew I wasn't imagining how odd this was. The inspector had completely changed direction. He'd been about to arrest us. I was sure of it. And then, out of the blue, he was deporting Carter? Even the other police officers looked confused. "Sir," the policewoman asked, "are you sure?" "Quite, Linley. The 2 of you may go." The cops hesitated until Williams made a shooing motion with his hand. Then they left, closing the door behind them. "Hold on," Carter said. "My father's disappeared, and you want me to leave the country?" "Your father is either dead or a fugitive, son," the inspector said. "Deportation is the kindest option. It's already been arranged." "With whom?" Gramps demanded. "Who authorized this?" "With..." The inspector got that funny blank look again. "With the proper authorities. Believe me, it's better than prison." Carter looked too devastated to speak, but before I could feel sorry for him, Inspector Williams turned on me. "You too, miss." He might as well have hit me with a sledgehammer. "You're deporting me?" I asked. "I live here." "You're an American citizen, and under the circumstances, it's best for you to return home." I just stared at him. I couldn't remember any home except this flat. My mates at school, my room, everything I knew was here. Where am I supposed to go? Inspector, Gran said, her voice trembling, this isn't fair. I can't believe... I'll give you time to say goodbye, the inspector interrupted. Then he frowned as if baffled by his own actions. I must be going. This made no sense, and the inspector seemed to realize it, but he walked to the front door anyway. When he opened it, I almost jumped out of my chair because the man in black, Amos, was standing there. He'd lost his trench coat and hat somewhere, but was still wearing the same pinstripe suit and round glasses. His braided hair glittered with gold beads. I thought the inspector would say something or express surprise, but he didn't even acknowledge Amos. He walked right past him and into the night. Amos came inside and closed the door. Gran and Gramps stood up. You, Gramps growled. I should have known. If I was younger, I'd beat you to a pulp. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Faust, Amos said. He looked at Carter and me as if we were problems to be solved. It's time we had a talk. Amos made himself right at home. He flopped onto the sofa and poured himself tea. He munched on a biscuit, which was quite dangerous, because Gran's biscuits are horrid. I thought Gramps' head would explode. His face went bright red. He came up behind Amos and raised his hand as if he were about to smack him, but Amos kept munching his biscuit. Please, sit down, he told us. And we all sat. It was the strangest thing, as if we'd been waiting for his order. Even Gramps dropped his hand and moved round the sofa. He sat next to Amos with a disgusted sigh. Amos sipped his tea and regarded me with some displeasure. That wasn't fair, I thought. I didn't look that bad, considering what I'd been through. Then he looked at Carter and grunted. Terrible timing, he muttered. But there's no other way. They'll have to come with me. Excuse me, I said. I'm not going anywhere with some strange man with biscuit on his face. He did, in fact, have biscuit crumbs on his face, but he apparently didn't care, as he didn't bother to check. I'm no stranger, Sadie, he said. Don't you remember? It was creepy hearing him talk to me in such a familiar way. I felt I should know him. I looked at Carter, but he seemed just as mystified as I was. No, Amos, Gran said, trembling. You can't take Sadie. We had an agreement. Julius broke that agreement tonight, Amos said. You know we can't care for Sadie anymore. Not after what's happened. Their only chance is to come with me. Why should we come anywhere with you? Carter asked. You almost got into a fight with Dad. Amos looked at the work bag in Carter's lap. I see you kept your father's bag. That's good. You'll need it. As for getting into fights, Julius and I did that quite a lot. If you didn't notice, Carter, I was trying to stop him from doing something rash. If he'd listened to me, he wouldn't be in this situation. I had no idea what he was on about, but Gramps apparently understood. You and your superstitions, he said. I told you we want none of it. Amos pointed to the back patio. Through the glass doors you could see the light shining on the Thames. It was quite a nice view at night, when you couldn't notice how run down some of the buildings were. Superstition, is it? Amos asked. And yet you found a place to live on the east bank of the river. Gramps turned even redder. That was Ruby's idea. Thought it would protect us. She was wrong about many things, wasn't she? She trusted Julius and you, for one. Amos looked unfazed. He smelled interesting, like old-timey spices, copal and amber, like the incense shops in Covent Garden. He finished his tea and looked straight at Gran. Mrs. Faust, you know what's begun. The police are the least of your worries. Gran swallowed. You changed that inspector's mind, he You made him deport Sadie. It was that or see the children arrested, Amos said. Hang on, I said. You changed Inspector Williams' mind? How? Amos shrugged. It's not permanent. In fact, we should get to New York in the next hour or so before Inspector Williams begins to wonder why he let you go. Carter laughed incredulously. You can't get to New York from London in an hour. Not even the fastest plane. No. Amos agreed. Not a plane. He turned back to Gran as if everything had been settled. Mrs. Faust, Carter and Sadie have only one safe option. You know that. They'll come to the mansion in Brooklyn. I can protect them there. You've got a mansion, Carter said, in Brooklyn. Amos gave him an amused smile. The family mansion. You'll be safe there. But our dad is beyond your help for now, Amos said sadly. I'm sorry, Carter. I'll explain later, but Julius would want you to be safe. For that, we must move quickly. I'm afraid I'm all you've got. That was a bit harsh, I thought. Carter glanced at Gran and Gramps. Then he nodded glumly. He knew that they didn't want him around. He'd always reminded him of our dad. And yes, it was a stupid reason not to take in your grandson, but there it was. Well, Carter can do what he wants, I said, but I live here, and I'm not going off with some stranger, am I? I looked at Gran for support, but she was staring at the lace doilies on the table as if they were suddenly quite interesting. Gramps, surely. But he wouldn't meet my eyes either. He turned to Amos. You can get them out of the country? Hang on, I protested. Amos stood and wiped the crumbs off his jacket. He walked to the patio doors and stared out at the river. The police will be back soon. Tell them anything you like. They won't find us. You going to kidnap us? I asked, stunned. I looked at Carter. Do you believe this? Carter shouldered the work bag. Then he stood like he was ready to go. Possibly he just wanted to be out of Gran and Gramps' flat. How do you plan to get to New York in an hour? He asked Amos. You said not a plane. No, Amos agreed. He put his finger to the window and traced something in the condensation. Another bloody hieroglyph. A boat, I said, then realized I translated aloud, which I wasn't supposed to be able to do. Amos peered at me over the top of his round glasses. How did you... I mean, that last bit looks like a boat, I blurted out. But that can't be what you mean. That's ridiculous. Look, Carter cried. I pressed in next to him at the patio doors. Down at the quayside, a boat was docked. But not a regular boat, mind you. It was an Egyptian reed boat with 2 torches burning in the front and a big rudder in the back. A figure in a black trench coat and hat, possibly Amos's, stood at the tiller. I'll admit, for once, I was at a loss for words. We're going in that, Carter said, to Brooklyn. We'd better get started, Amos said. I rode back to my grandmother. Gran, please. She brushed a tear from her cheek. It's for the best, my dear. You should take Muffin. Ah, yes, Amos said. We can't forget the cat. He turned toward the stairs. As if on cue, Muffin raced down in a leopard-spotted streak and leaped into my arms. She never does that. Who are you? I asked Amos. It was clear I was running out of options, but I at least wanted answers. We can't just go off with some stranger. I'm not a stranger, Amos smiled at me. I'm family. And suddenly I remembered his face smiling down at me, saying, Happy birthday, Sadie. A memory so distant I'd almost forgotten. Uncle Amos? I asked hazily. That's right, Sadie, he said. I'm Julius's brother. Now come along. We have a long way to go. Chapter 5. We Meet the Monkey. It's Carter again. Sorry. We had to turn off the tape for a while because we were being followed by, well, we'll get to that later. Sadie was telling you how we left London, right? So anyway, we followed Amos down to the weird boat docked at the quayside. I cradled Dad's work bag under my arm. I still couldn't believe he was gone. I felt guilty about leaving London without him, but I believed Amos about one thing. Right now, Dad was beyond our help. I didn't trust Amos, but I figured if I wanted to find out what happened to Dad, I was going to have to go along with him. He was the only one who seemed to know anything. Amos stepped aboard the reed boat. Sadie jumped right on, but I hesitated. I'd seen boats like this on the Nile before, and they never seemed very sturdy. It was basically woven together from coils of plant fiber, like a giant floating rug. I figured the torches at the front couldn't be a good idea, but because if we didn't sink, we'd burn. At the back, the tiller was manned by a little guy wearing Amos's black trench coat and hat. The hat was shoved down on his head, so I couldn't see his face. His hands and feet were lost in the folds of the coat. "How does this thing move?" I asked Amos. "You've got no sail." "Trust me." Amos offered me a hand. The night was cold, but when I stepped on board, I suddenly felt warmer, as if the torchlight was casting a protective glow over us. In the middle of the boat was a hut made from woven mats. From Sadie's arms, Muffin sniffed at it and growled. "Take a seat inside," Amos suggested. "The trip might be a little rough." "I'll stand, thanks." Sadie nodded at the little guy in back. "Who's your driver?" Amos acted as if he hadn't heard the question. "Hang on, everyone." He nodded to the steersman, and the boat lurched forward. The feeling was hard to describe. You know that tingle in the pit of your stomach when you're on a roller coaster and it goes into free fall? It was kind of like that, except we weren't falling and the feeling didn't go away. The boat moved with astounding speed. The lights of the city blurred, then were swallowed in a thick fog. Strange sounds echoed in the dark, slithering and hissing, distant screams, voices whispering in languages I didn't understand. The tingling turned to nausea. The sounds got louder until I was about to scream myself. Then suddenly, the boat slowed. The noises stopped, and the fog dissipated. City lights came back, brighter than before. Above us loomed a bridge, much taller than any bridge in London. My stomach did a slow roll. To the left, I saw a familiar skyline. The Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building. "Impossible," I said. "That's New York." Sadie looked as green as I felt. She was still cradling Muffin, whose eyes were closed. The cat seemed to be purring. "It can't be," Sadie said. "We only traveled a few minutes." And yet, here we were, sailing up the East River, right under the Williamsburg Bridge. We glided to a stop next to a small dock on the Brooklyn side of the river. In front of us was an industrial yard filled with piles of scrap metal and old construction equipment. In the center of it all, right at the water's edge, rose a huge factory warehouse, heavily painted with graffiti, the windows boarded up. "That is not a mansion," Sadie said. Her powers of perception are really amazing. "Look again." Amos pointed to the top of the building. How did you..." My voice failed me. I wasn't sure why I hadn't seen it before, but now it was obvious. A 5-story mansion perched on the roof of the warehouse, like another layer of a cake. "You couldn't build a mansion up there." "Long story," Amos said, "but we needed a private location." And is this the East Shore? Sadie asked. You said something about that in London, my grandparents living on the East Shore. Amos smiled. Yes. Very good, Sadie. In ancient times, the east bank of the Nile was always the side of the living, the side where the sun rises. The dead were buried west of the river. It was considered bad luck, even dangerous to live there. The tradition is still strong among our people. Our people, I asked, but Sadie muscled in with another question. So you can't live in Manhattan? She asked. Amos's brow furrowed as he looked across at the Empire State Building. Manhattan has other problems, other gods. It's best we stay separate. Other what? Sadie demanded. Nothing. Amos walked past us to the steersman. He plucked off the man's hat and coat, and there was no one underneath. The steersman simply wasn't there. Amos put on his fedora, folded his coat over his arm, then waved towards the metal staircase that wound all the way up the side of the warehouse to the mansion on the roof. All ashore, he said, and welcome to the 21st gnome. Gnome? I asked as we followed him upstairs. Like the little runty guys? Heavens no, Amos said. I hate gnomes. They smell horrible. But you said gnome, N-O-M-E, is in a district, a region. The term is from ancient times when Egypt was divided into 42 provinces. Today the system is a little different. We've gone global. The world is divided into 360 gnomes. Egypt, of course, is the first. Greater New York is the 21st. Sadie glanced at me and twirled her finger around her temple. No, Sadie, Amos said without looking back. I'm not crazy. There's just much you need to learn. We reached the top of the stairs. Looking up at the mansion, it was hard to understand what I was seeing. The house was at least 50 feet tall, built of enormous limestone blocks and steel-framed windows. There were hieroglyphs engraved around the windows, and the walls were lit up so the place looked like a cross between a modern museum and an ancient temple. But the weirdest thing was that if I glanced away, the whole building seemed to disappear. I tried it several times just to be sure. If I looked for the mansion from the corner of my eye, it wasn't there. I had to force my eyes to refocus on it, and even then it took a lot of willpower. Amos stopped before the entrance, which was the size of a garage door. A dark, heavy square of timber with no visible handle or lock. Carter, after you. How do you think? Great, another mystery. I was about to suggest we ram Amos's head against it and see if that worked. Then I looked at the door again, and I had the strangest feeling. I stretched out my arm, slowly, without touching the door. I raised my hand, and the door followed my movement, sliding upward until it disappeared into the ceiling. Sadie looked stunned. How? I don't know, I admitted, a little embarrassed. Motion sensor, maybe? Interesting. Amos sounded a little troubled. Not the way I would have done it, but very good. Remarkably good. Thanks, I think. Sadie tried to go inside first, but as soon as she stepped on the threshold, Muffin wailed and almost clawed her way out of Sadie's arm. Sadie stumbled back. What was that about, Cat? Oh, of course, Amos said. My apologies. He put his hand on the cat's head and said very formally, You may enter. The cat needs permission? I asked. Special circumstances, Amos said, which wasn't much of an explanation, but he walked inside without saying another word. We followed, and this time Muffin stayed quiet. Oh my God. Sadie's jaw dropped. She craned her neck to look at the ceiling, and I thought the gum might fall out of her mouth. Yes, Amos said. This is the great room. I could see why he called it that. The cedar beam ceiling was 4 stories high, held up by carved stone pillars engraved with hieroglyphs. A weird assortment of musical instruments and ancient Egyptian weapons decorated the walls. 3 levels of balconies ringed the room, with rows of doors all around, looking out of the main area. The fireplace was big enough to park a car in, with a plasma screen TV above the mantel and massive leather sofas on either side. On the floor was a snakeskin rug, except it was 40 feet long and 15 feet wide, bigger than any snake. Outside, through glass walls, I could see the terrace that wrapped around the house. It had a swimming pool, a dining area, and a blazing fire pit. And at the far end of the great room was a set of double doors marked with the Eye of Horus, and chained with 6 padlocks. I wondered what could possibly be behind them. But the real showstopper was the statue in the center of the great room. It was 30 feet tall, made of black marble. I could tell it was of an Egyptian god because the figure had a human body and an animal's head, like a stork or a crane, with a long neck and a really long beak. The god was dressed in ancient style, in a kilt, sash, and neck collar. He held a scribe's stylus in one hand and an open scroll in the other, as if he had just written the hieroglyphs inscribed there. An ankh, the Egyptian looped cross, with a rectangle traced around its top. "That's it!" Sadie exclaimed. "Per ankh!" I stared at her in disbelief. "All right, how can you read that?" "I don't know," she said, "but it's obvious, isn't it? The top one is shaped like the floor plan of a house." "How did you get that? It's just a box." The thing was, she was right. I recognized the symbol, and it was supposed to be a simplified picture of a house with a doorway, but that wouldn't be obvious to most people, especially people named Sadie. Yet she looked absolutely positive. "It's a house," she insisted, "and the bottom picture is the ankh, the symbol for life. Per ankh, the house of life." "Very good, Sadie." Amos looked impressed. "And this is a statue of the only god still allowed in the house of life, at least normally. Do you recognize him, Carter?" Just then it clicked. The bird was an ibis, an Egyptian river bird. "Thoth," I said, "the god of knowledge. He invented writing." "Indeed," Amos said. "Why the animal heads?" Sadie asked. "All those Egyptian gods have animal heads. They look so silly." "They don't normally appear that way," Amos said. "Not in real life." "Real life?" I asked. "Come on. You sound like you've met them in person." Amos's expression didn't reassure me. He looked as if he were remembering something unpleasant. "The gods could appear in many forms, usually fully human or fully animal, but occasionally as a hybrid form like this. They are primal forces, you understand, a sort of bridge between humanity and nature. They are depicted with animal heads to show you that they exist in 2 different worlds at once. Do you understand?" "Not even a little," Sadie said. Amos didn't sound surprised. "Yes, we have much training to do. At any rate, the god before you, Thoth, founded the House of Life, for which this mansion is the regional headquarters, or at least it used to be. I'm the only member left in the 21st Gnome, or I was, until you 2 came along." "Hang on." I had so many questions I could hardly think where to start. What is the House of Life? Why is Thoth the only god allowed here? And why are you... Carter, I understand how you feel. Amos smiled sympathetically. But these things are better discussed in daylight. You need to get some sleep. And I don't want you to have nightmares. You think I can sleep? Meow. Muffin stretched in Sadie's arms and let loose a huge yawn. Amos clapped his hands. Khufu. I thought he'd sneeze because Khufu is a weird name, but then a little dude about 3 feet tall with gold fur and a purple shirt came clambering down the stairs. It took me a second to realize it was a baboon wearing an LA Lakers jersey. The baboon did a flip and landed in front of us. He showed off his fangs and made a sound that was a half roar, half belch. His breath smelled like nacho-flavored Doritos. All I could think to say was, "The Lakers are my home team!" The baboon slapped his head with both hands and belched again. "Oh, Khufu likes you," Amos said. "You'll get along famously." "Right." Sadie looked dazed. "You've got a monkey butler. Why not?" Muffin purred in Sadie's arms as if the baboon didn't bother her at all. "Ah!" Khufu grunted at me. Amos chuckled. "He wants to go one-on-one with you, Carter, to, see your game." I shifted from foot to foot. Yeah, sure. Maybe tomorrow. But how can you understand? Carter, I'm afraid you'll have a lot to get used to, Amos said. But if you're going to survive and save your father, you have to get some rest. Sorry, Sadie said. Did you say survive and save our father? Could you expand on that? Tomorrow, Amos said. You'll begin your orientation in the morning. Khufu, show them to their rooms, please. Ah! The baboon grunted. He turned and waddled up the stairs. Unfortunately, the Lakers jersey didn't completely cover his multicolored rear. We were about to follow when Amos said, Carter, the work bag, please. It's best if I lock it in the library. I hesitated. I'd almost forgotten the bag on my shoulder. But it was all I had left of my father. I didn't even have our luggage because it was still locked up at the British Museum. Honestly, I'd been surprised that the police hadn't taken the work bag too, but none of them seemed to notice it. You'll get it back, Amos promised, when the time is right. He asked nicely enough, but something in his eyes told me that I really didn't have a choice. I handed over the bag. Amos took it gingerly as if it were full of explosives. See you in the morning. He turned and strode toward the chained-up doors. They unlatched themselves and opened just enough for Amos to slip through without showing us anything on the other side. Then the chains locked again behind him. I looked at Sadie, unsure what to do. Staying by ourselves in the great room with the creepy statue of Thoth didn't seem like much fun, so we followed Khufu up the stairs. Sadie and I got adjoining rooms on the 3rd floor, and I've got to admit, they were way cooler than any place I'd ever stayed before. I had my own kitchenette, fully stocked with my favorite snacks, ginger ale. No, Sadie, it's not an old person soda. Be quiet. Twix and Skittles. It seemed impossible. How did Amos know what I liked? The TV, computer, and stereo system were totally high-tech. The bathroom was stocked with my regular brand of toothpaste, deodorant, everything. The king-size bed was awesome too, though the pillow was a little strange. Instead of a cloth pillow, it was an ivory headrest like I'd seen in Egyptian tombs. It was decorated with lions and, of course, more hieroglyphs. The room even had a deck that looked out on New York Harbor, with views of Manhattan and the Statue of Liberty in the distance. But the sliding glass doors were locked shut somehow. That was my first indication that something was wrong. I turned to look for Khufu, but he was gone. The door to my room was shut. I tried to open it, but it was locked. A muffled voice came from the next room. Carter? Sadie. I tried the door to her adjoining room, but it was locked too. We're prisoners, she said. Do you think can we trust him? After all I'd seen today, I didn't trust anything. But I could hear the fear in Sadie's voice. It triggered an unfamiliar feeling in me, like I needed to reassure her. The idea seemed ridiculous. Sadie had always been so much braver than me, doing what she wanted, never caring about the consequences. I was the one who got scared, but right now, I felt like I needed to play a role I hadn't played in a long, long time. Big brother. It'll be okay. I tried to sound confident. Look, if Amos wanted to hurt us, he could have done it by now. Try to get some sleep. Carter? Yeah. It was magic, wasn't it? What happened to Dad at the museum? Amos's boat? This house? All of it's magic. I think so. I could hear her sigh. Good. At least I'm not going mad. Don't let the bed bugs bite, I called, and I realized I hadn't said that to Sadie since we lived together in Los Angeles, when Mom was still alive. I miss Dad, she said. I hardly ever saw him, I know, but I miss him. My eyes got a little teary, but I took a deep breath. I was not going to go all weak. Sadie needed me. Dad needed us. We'll find him, I told her. Pleasant dreams. I listened, but the only thing I heard was Muffin meowing and scampering around, exploring her new space. At least she didn't seem unhappy. I got ready for bed and crawled in. The covers were comfortable and warm, but the pillow was just too weird. It gave my neck cramps. So I put it on the floor and went to sleep without it. My first big mistake. Chapter 6. Breakfast with a Crocodile. How to describe it? Not a nightmare. It was much more real and frightening. As I slept, I felt myself go weightless. I drifted up, turned, and saw my own sleeping form below. I'm dying, I thought. But that wasn't it either. I wasn't a ghost. I had a new shimmering golden form with wings instead of arms. I was some kind of bird. No, Sadie, not a chicken. Will you please let me tell the story? I knew I wasn't dreaming because I don't dream in color. I certainly don't dream in all 5 senses. The room smelled faintly of jasmine. I could hear the carbonation bubbles pinging in the can of ginger ale I'd opened on my nightstand. I could feel a cold wind ruffling through my feathers, and I realized the windows were open. I didn't want to leave, but a strong current pulled me out of the room like a leaf in a storm. The lights of the mansion faded below me. The skyline of New York blurred and disappeared. I shot through the mist and darkness, strange voices whispering all around me. My stomach tingled as it had earlier in the night on Amos's barge. Then the mist cleared, and I was in a different place. I floated above a barren mountain. Far below, a grid of city lights stretched across the valley floor. Definitely not New York. It was nighttime, but I could tell I was in the desert. The wind was so dry, the skin on my face was like paper. And I know that doesn't make sense, but my face, like my normal face, as if that part of me hadn't transferred into a bird. Fine, Sadie, call me the Carter-headed chicken. Happy? Below me on a ridge stood 2 figures. They didn't seem to notice me, and I realized I wasn't glowing anymore. In fact, I was pretty much invisible, floating in the darkness. I couldn't make out the 2 figures clearly, except to recognize that they weren't human. Staring harder, I could see the one was short, squat, and hairless, with slimy skin that glistened in the sunlight. like an amphibian standing on its hind legs. The other was tall and scarecrow skinny, with rooster claws instead of feet. I couldn't see his face very well, but it looked red and moist, and, well, let's just say I was glad I could not see it better. "Where is he?" the toady-looking one croaked nervously. "Hasn't taken a permanent host yet," the rooster-footed guy chided. "He can only appear for a short time." "You're sure this is the place?" "Yes, fool! He'll be here as soon as—" A fiery form appeared on the ridge. The two creatures fell to the ground, groveling in the dirt, and I prayed like crazy that I was really invisible. "My lord," the toad said. Even in the dark, the newcomer was hard to see. Just the silhouette of a man outlined in flames. "What do they call this place?" the man asked. And as soon as he spoke, I knew for sure he was the guy who had attacked my dad at the British Museum. All the fear I'd felt at the museum came rushing back, paralyzing me. I remembered trying to pick up that stupid rock to throw, but I hadn't been able to do that. I'd completely failed my dad. "My lord," Roosterfoot said, "the mountain is called Camelback. The city is called Phoenix." The fiery man laughed, a booming sound like thunder. "Phoenix. How appropriate. And the desert so much like home. All it needs now is to be scoured of life. The desert should be a sterile place, don't you think?" "Oh, yes, my lord," the toady agreed. "But what of the other four?" "One is already entombed," the fiery man said. "The second is weak. She will be easily manipulated. That leaves only two, and they will be dealt with soon enough." How?" the toady asked. The fiery man glowed brighter. "You are an inquisitive little tadpole, aren't you?" He pointed at the toad, and the poor creature's skin began to steam. "No!" the toady begged. "No!" I could hardly watch. I don't want to describe it, but if you heard what happens when cruel kids pour salt on snails, you'll have a pretty good idea of what happened to the toady. Soon there was nothing left. Roosterfoot took a nervous step back. I couldn't blame him. "We will build my temple here," the fiery man said, as if nothing had happened. "This mountain shall serve as my place of worship. When it is complete, I will summon the greatest storm ever known. I will cleanse everything. Everything." "Yes, my lord," Roosterfoot agreed quickly. "And, if I may suggest, my lord, to increase your power." The creature bowed and scraped and moved forward, as if he wanted to whisper in the fiery man's ear. Just when I thought Roosterfoot was going to become fried chicken for sure, he said something to the fiery dude that I couldn't make out, and the fiery dude burned brighter. "Excellent! If you can do this, you will be rewarded. If not—" "I understand, my lord." "Go then," the fireman said. "Unleash our forces. Start with the long necks. That should soften them up. Collect the younglings and bring them to me. I want them alive before they have time to learn their powers. Do not fail me." "No, lord." "Phoenix," the fireman mused. "I like that very much." He swept his hand across the horizon as if he were imagining the city in flames. "Soon I will rise from your ashes. It will be a lovely birthday present." I woke with my heart pounding, back in my own body. I felt hot, as if the fiery guy were starting to burn me. Then I realized that there was a cat on my chest. Muffin stared at me, her eyes half closed. "Meow." "How did you get in?" I muttered. I sat up, and for a second I wasn't sure where I was. Some hotel in another city? I almost called for my dad. And then I remembered. Yesterday, the museum, the sarcophagus. It all crashed down on me so hard I could barely breathe. Stop, I told myself. You don't have time for grief. And this is going to sound weird, but the voice in my head almost sounded like a different person, older, stronger. Either that was a good sign or I was going crazy. Remember what you saw, the voice said. He's after you. You have to be ready. I shivered. I wanted to believe I had just had a bad dream, but I knew better. I'd been through so much in the last day to doubt what I'd seen. Somehow, I'd actually left my body while I slept. I'd been to Phoenix, thousands of miles away. The fiery dude was there. I hadn't understood much of what he'd said, but he talked about sending his forces to capture the younglings. Gee, wonder who that could be. Muffin jumped off the bed and sniffed at the ivory headrest, looking up at me as if she were trying to tell me something. You can have it, I told her. It's uncomfortable. She butted her head against it and stared at me accusingly. Meow. Whatever, cat. I got up and showered. When I tried to get dressed, I found that my old clothes had disappeared in the night. Everything in the closet was my size, but way different than what I was used to. Baggy drawstring pants and loose shirts, all plain white linen, and robes for cold weather, kind of what the fellahin, the peasants in Egypt wear. It wasn't exactly my style. Sadie likes to tell me that I don't have a style. She complains that I dress like I'm an old man. Button-down shirt, slacks, dress shoes. Okay, maybe. But here's the thing. My dad had always drilled into my head that I had to dress my best. I remember the first time he explained to me. I was 10. We were on our way to the airport in Athens, and it was like 112 degrees outside. And I was complaining that I wanted to wear shorts and a t-shirt. Why couldn't I be comfortable? We weren't going anywhere important that day, just traveling. My dad put his hand on my shoulder. Carter, you're getting older. You're an African-American man. People will judge you more harshly, and so you must always look impeccable. That isn't fair, I insisted. Fairness does not mean everyone gets the same, Dad said. Fairness means everyone gets what they need. And the only way to get what you need is to make it happen yourself. Do you understand? I told him that I did. But still, I did what he asked. Like caring about Egypt, and basketball and music. Like traveling with only one suitcase. I dressed the way Dad wanted me to, because Dad was usually right. In fact, I'd never known him to be wrong until the night at the British Museum. Anyway, I put on the linen clothes from the closet. The slipper shoes were comfortable, though I doubted they'd be much good to run in. The door to Sadie's room was ajar, but she wasn't there. Thankfully, my bedroom door wasn't locked anymore. Muffin joined me and we walked downstairs, passing a lot of unoccupied bedrooms on the way. The mansion could have easily slept 100 people, but instead it felt empty and sad. Down in the great room, Khufu, the baboon, sat on the sofa with a basketball between his legs and a chunk of strange-looking meat in his hands. It was covered in pink feathers. ESPN was on the television, and Khufu was watching highlights from the game the night before. Hey, I said, though I felt a little weird talking to him. Lakers win? Khufu looked at me and patted his basketball like he wanted a game. Ah, ah! He had a pink feather hanging from his chin, and the sight made my stomach do a slow roll. Yeah. I said, we'll play later, okay? I could see Sadie and Amos out on the terrace, eating breakfast by the pool. It should have been freezing out there, but their fire pit was blazing, and neither Amos nor Sadie looked cold. I headed their way, then hesitated in front of the statue of Thoth. In the daylight, the bird-headed god didn't look quite so scary. Still, I could swear those beady eyes were watching me expectantly. What had the fiery guy said last night? Something about catching us before we learned our powers. It sounded ridiculous, but for a moment I felt a surge of strength. Like the night before when I'd opened the front door just by raising my hand. I felt like I could lift anything, even this 30-foot tall statue if I wanted to. In a kind of trance, I stepped forward. Muffin meowed impatiently and butted my foot. The feeling dissolved. You're right, I told the cat. Stupid idea. Besides, I could smell breakfast now. French toast, bacon, hot chocolate, and I couldn't blame Muffin for being in a hurry. I followed her out to the terrace. Ah, Carter, Amos said. Merry Christmas, my boy. Join us. About time, Sadie grumbled. I've been up for ages. But she held my eyes for a moment like she was thinking the same thing I was. Christmas. We hadn't spent a Christmas morning together since Mom died. I wondered if Sadie remembered how we used to make God's eyes decorations out of yarn and popsicle sticks. Amos poured himself a cup of coffee. His clothes were similar to those he'd worn the day before, and I had to admit the guy had style. His tailored suit was made of blue wool. He wore a matching fedora, and his hair was freshly braided with dark blue lapis lazuli, one of the stones the Egyptians often used for jewelry. Even his glasses matched. The round lenses were tinted blue. A tenor sax rested on a stand near the fire pit, and I could totally picture him playing out there, serenading the East River. As for Sadie, she was dressed in a white linen pajama outfit like me, but somehow she'd managed to keep her combat boots. She'd probably slept with them on. She looked pretty comical with the red-streaked hair and the outfit, but since I wasn't dressed any better, I could hardly make fun of her. Amos? I asked. You didn't have any pet birds, did you? Khufu's eating something with pink feathers. Amos sipped his coffee. Sorry if that disturbed you. Khufu's very picky. He only eats foods that end in O. Doritos, burritos, flamingos. I blinked. Did you say... Carter, Sadie warned. She looked a little queasy, like she'd already had this conversation. Don't ask. Okay, I said, not asking. Carter, please help yourself. Amos waved toward a buffet table piled high with food. Then we can get started with the explanations. I didn't see any flamingo on the buffet table, which was fine by me, but there was just about everything else. I snacked some pancakes with butter and syrup, some bacon, and a glass of OJ. Then I noticed movement in the corner of my eye. I glanced at the swimming pool. Something long and pale was gliding just under the surface of the water. I almost dropped my plate. Is that... a crocodile? Amos conferred. For good luck. He's albino, but please don't mention it. He's sensitive. His name is Philip of Macedonia, Sadie informed me. I wasn't sure how Sadie was taking this all so calmly, but I figured if she wasn't freaking out, I shouldn't either. That's a long name, I said. He's a long crocodile, Sadie said. Oh, and he likes bacon. To prove her point, she tossed a piece of bacon over her shoulder. Philip lunged out of the water and snapped up his treat. His hide was pure white, and his eyes were pink. His mouth was so big he could have snapped up an entire pig. He's quite harmless to my friends, Amos assured me. In the old days, no temple would be complete without a lake full of crocodiles. They are powerful magical creatures. Right, I said. So the baboon, the crocodile, any other pets I should know about? Amos thought for a moment. Visible ones? No, I think that's it. I took a seat as far from the pool as possible. Muffin circled my leg and purred. I hope she had enough sense to stay away from magic crocodiles named Philip. So, Amos, I said between bites of pancake. Explanations. Yes, he agreed. Where to start? Our dad, Sadie suggested. What happened to him? Amos took a deep breath. Julius was attempting to summon a god. Unfortunately, it worked. It was kind of hard to take Amos seriously, talking about summoning gods while he spread butter on a bagel. Any god in particular? I asked casually, or did he just order a generic god? Sadie kicked me under the table. She was scowling as if she actually believed what Amos was saying. Amos took a bite of bagel. There are many Egyptian gods, Carter, but your dad was after one in particular. He looked at me meaningfully. Osiris, I remembered. When Dad was standing in front of the Rosetta Stone, he said, Osiris, come. But Osiris is a legend. He's make-believe. Huh. I wish that were true. Amos stared across the East River at the Manhattan skyline, gleaming in the morning sun. The ancient Egyptians were not fools, Carter. They built the pyramids. They created the first great nation-state. Their civilization lasted thousands of years. Yeah, I said, and now they're gone. Amos shook his head. A legacy that powerful does not disappear. Next to the Egyptians, the Greeks and Romans were babies. Our modern nations like Great Britain and America? Blinks of an eye. The very oldest root of civilization, at least of Western civilization. Chapter 6, Part 2, Breakfast with a Crocodile. Look at the pyramid on the dollar bill. Look at the Washington Monument, the world's largest Egyptian obelisk. Egypt is still very much alive, and so, unfortunately, are her gods. Come on, I argued. I mean, even if I believe there's a real thing called magic, believing in ancient gods is totally different. You're joking, right? But as I said it, I thought about the fiery guy in the museum, the way his face had shifted between human and animal, and the statue of Thoth, how its eyes had followed me. Carter, Amos said, the Egyptians would not have been stupid enough to believe in imaginary gods. The beings they described in their myths are very, very real. In the old days, the priests of Egypt would call upon these gods to channel their power and perform great feats. That is the origin of what we now call magic. Like many things, magic was first invented by the Egyptians. Each temple had a branch of magicians called the House of Life. Their magicians were famed throughout the ancient world. And you're an Egyptian magician. Amos nodded. So was your father. You saw it for yourself last night. I hesitated. It was hard to deny my dad had done some weird stuff at the museum. Some stuff that looked like magic. But he's an archaeologist, I said stubbornly. That's his cover story. You'll remember that he specialized in translating ancient spells, which are very difficult to understand unless you work magic yourself. Our family, the Kane family, has been a part of the House of Life almost since the beginning. And your mother's family is almost as ancient. The Fausts? I tried to imagine Grandma and Grandpa Faust doing magic, but unless watching rugby on TV and burning cookies was magical, I couldn't see it. They had not practiced magic for many generations, Amos admitted. Not until your mother came along, but yes, a very ancient bloodline. Sadie shook her head in disbelief. So now Mum was magic too? Are you joking? No jokes, Amos promised. The two of you. You combine the blood of two ancient families, both of which have a long, complicated history with the gods. You are the most powerful Cain children to be born in many centuries. I tried to let that sink in. At the moment, I didn't feel powerful. I felt queasy. You're telling me our parents secretly worshipped animal-headed gods? I asked. Not worshipped, Amos corrected. By the end of ancient times, the Egyptians had learned that their gods were not to be worshipped. They were powerful beings, primeval forces, but they are not divine in the sense that one might think of God. They are created entities, like mortals, only much more powerful. We can respect them, fear them, use their power, or even fight them to keep them under control. Fight gods? Sadie interrupted. Constantly, Amos assured her. But we don't worship them. Thoth taught us that. I looked at Sadie for help. The old guy had to be crazy, but Sadie was looking like she believed every word. So, I said, why did Dad break the Rosetta Stone? Oh, I'm sure he didn't mean to break it, Amos said. That would have horrified him. In fact, I imagine my brethren in London have repaired the damage by now. The curators will soon check their vaults and discover that the Rosetta Stone miraculously survived the explosion. But it was blown into 1,000,000 pieces, I said. How could they repair it? Amos picked up a saucer and threw it onto the stone floor. The saucer shattered instantly. That was to destroy, Amos said. I could have done it by magic. Hadi. But it's simpler just to smash it. And now, Amos held out his hand. Join. Hanim. A blue hieroglyphic symbol burned in the air above his palm. The pieces of the saucer flew into his hand and reassembled like a puzzle, even the smallest bits of dust gluing themselves into place. Amos put the perfect saucer back on the table. Some trick, I managed. I tried to sound calm about it, but I was thinking about all the odd things that had happened to my dad and me over the years, like those gunmen in the Cairo hotel who ended up hanging by their feet from a chandelier. Was it possible my dad had made that happen with some kind of spell? Amos poured milk in the saucer and put it on the floor. Muffin came padding over. At any rate, your father would never have intentionally damaged a relic. He simply didn't realize how much power the Rosetta Stone contained. You see, as Egypt faded, its magic collected and concentrated into its remaining relics. Most of these, of course, are still in Egypt, but you can find some in almost every major museum. A magician can use those artifacts as focal points to work more powerful spells. I don't get it, I said. Amos spread his hands. I'm sorry, Carter. It takes years of study to understand magic, and I'm trying to explain it to you in a single morning. The important thing is, for the past 6 years, your father has been looking for a way to summon Osiris, and last night he thought he had found the right artifact to do it. Wait, why did he want Osiris? Sadie gave me a troubled look. Carter, Osiris was the Lord of the Dead. Dad was talking about making things right. He was talking about Mum. Suddenly the morning seemed colder. The fire pit sputtered in the wind coming off the river. He wanted to bring Mom back from the dead? I asked. But that's crazy. Amos hesitated. It would have been dangerous, inadvisable, foolish, but not crazy. Your father is a powerful magician. If, in fact, that is what he was after, he might have accomplished it, using the power of Osiris. I stared at Sadie. You're actually buying this? You saw the magic at the museum, the fiery bloke. Dad summoned something from the stone. Yeah, I said, thinking of my dream. But that wasn't Osiris, was it? No, Amos said. Your father got more than he bargained for. He did release the spirit of Osiris. In fact, I think he successfully joined with the god. Joined with? Amos held up his hand. Another long conversation. For now, let's just say he drew the power of Osiris into himself, but he never got the chance to use it because, according to what Sadie has told me, it appears that Julius released 5 gods from the Rosetta Stone. 5 gods who were all trapped together. I glanced at Sadie. You told him everything? He's going to help us, Carter. I wasn't ready to trust this guy, even if he was our uncle, but I decided I didn't have much choice. Okay, yeah, I said. The fiery guy said something like, you released all 5. What did he mean? Amos sipped his coffee. The faraway look on his face reminded me of my dad. I don't want to scare you. Too late. The gods of Egypt are very dangerous. For the last 2,000 years or so, we magicians have spent most of our time binding and banishing them wherever they appear. In fact, our most important law, issued by Chief Lector Iskander in Roman times, forbids unleashing the gods or using their power. Your father broke that law once before. Sadie's face paled. Does this have something to do with Mum's death? Cleopatra's Needle in London? It has everything to do with that, Sadie. Your parents, well, they thought they were doing something good. They took a terrible risk, and it cost your mother her life. Your father took the blame. He was exiled, I suppose you would say, banished. He was forced to move around constantly because the house monitored his activities. They feared he would continue his research, as indeed he did. I thought about the times Dad would look over his shoulder as he copied some ancient inscriptions, or wake me up at 3 or 4 in the morning and insist it was time to change hotels, or warn me not to look in his work bag, or copy certain pictures from old temple walls as if our lives depended on it. Is that why you never came around? Sadie asked Amos. Because Dad was banished. The house forbade me to see him. I loved Julius. It hurt me to stay away from my brother and from you children, but I could not see you until last night when I simply had no choice but to try to help. Julius has been obsessed with finding Osiris for years. He was consumed with grief because of what happened to your mother. When I learned that Julius was about to break the law again, to try to set things right, I had to stop him. A second offense would have meant a death sentence. Unfortunately, I failed. I should have known he was too stubborn. I looked down at my plate. My food had gotten cold. Muffin leaped onto the table and rubbed against my hand. When I didn't object, she started eating my bacon. Last night at the museum, I said. The girl with the knife, the man with the forked beard, were they magicians too? From the House of Life? Yes, Amos said. Keeping an eye on your father. You are fortunate they let you go. The girl wanted to kill us, I remembered, but the guy with the beard said, not yet. They don't kill unless it is absolutely necessary, Amos said. They will wait to see if you are a threat. Why would we be a threat? Sadie demanded. We're children. The summoning wasn't our idea. Amos pushed away his plate. There is a reason you two were raised separately. Because the Faust took Dad to court, I said matter-of-factly, and Dad lost. It was much more than that, Amos said. The house insisted that you two be separated. Your father wanted to keep you both, even though he knew how dangerous it was. Sadie looked like she'd been smacked between the eyes. He did? Of course. But the house intervened and made sure your grandparents got sole custody of you, Sadie. If you and Carter were raised together, you could become very powerful. Perhaps you've already sensed changes over the past day. I thought about the surge of strength I'd been feeling, and the way Sadie suddenly seemed to know how to read ancient Egyptian. Then I thought of something even further back. Your 6th birthday, I told Sadie. The cake, she said immediately, the memory passing between us like an electric spark. At Sadie's 6th birthday party, the last one we'd shared as a family, Sadie and I had a huge argument. I don't remember what it was about. I think I wanted to blow out the candles for her. We started yelling. She grabbed my shirt. I pushed her. I remember Dad rushing toward us, trying to intervene. But before he could, Sadie's birthday cake exploded. Icing splattered the walls, our parents, the faces of Sadie's little 6-year-old friends. Mom and Dad separated us. They sent me to my room. Later, they said we must have hit the cake by accident as we were fighting, but I knew we hadn't. Something much weirder had made it explode, as if it had responded to our anger. I remembered Sadie crying with a chunk of cake on her forehead and an upside-down candle stuck to the ceiling with its wick still burning, and an adult visitor, one of my parents' friends, his glasses speckled with white frosting. I turned to Amos. That was you. You were at Sadie's party. Vanilla icing, he recalled. Very tasty. But it was clear even then that you two would be difficult to raise in the same household. And so, I faltered, what happens to us now? I didn't want to admit it, but I couldn't stand the thought of being separated from Sadie again. She wasn't much, but she was all I had. You must be trained properly, Amos said, whether the house approves or not. Why wouldn't they approve? I asked. I'll explain everything, don't worry. But we must start your lessons if we're to stand any chance of finding your father and putting things right. Otherwise, the entire world is in danger. If only we knew where... Phoenix, I blurted out. Amos stared at me. What? Last night I had, well, not a dream exactly. I felt stupid, but I told him what had happened while I slept. Judging from Amos's expression, the news was even worse than I thought. You're sure he said birthday present? He asked. Yeah, but what does that mean? And a permanent host, Amos said. He didn't have one yet? Well, that's what the rooster-footed guy said. That was a demon, Amos said. A minion of chaos. And if demons are coming through to the mortal world, we don't have much time. This is bad. Very bad. If you live in Phoenix, I said. Carter, our enemy, won't stop at Phoenix. If he's grown so powerful so fast, what did he say about the storm exactly? He said, I will summon the greatest storm ever known. Amos scowled. The last time he said that, he created the Sahara. A storm that large could destroy North America, generating enough chaos energy to give him an almost invincible form. What are you talking about? Who is this guy? Amos waved away the question. More important right now, why didn't you sleep with the headrest? I shrugged. It was uncomfortable. I looked at Sadie for support. You didn't use it, did you? Sadie rolled her eyes. Well, of course I did. It was obviously there for a reason. Sometimes I really hate my sister. Ow, that's my foot. Carter, Amos said, sleep is dangerous. It's a doorway into the duat. Lovely, Sadie grumbled, another strange word. Ah, yes, sorry, Amos said. The duat is the world of spirits and magic. It exists beneath the waking world like a vast ocean with many layers and regions. We submerged just under its surface last night to reach New York because travel through the duat is much faster. Carter, your consciousness also passed through its shallowest currents as you sleep. which is how you witness what happened in Phoenix. Fortunately, you survived that experience. But the deeper you go into the duat, the more horrible things you encounter, and the more difficult it is to return. There are entire realms filled with demons, places where the gods exist in their pure forms, so powerful, their mere presence would burn a human to ashes. There are prisons that hold beings of unspeakable evil, and some chasms so deep and chaotic that not even the gods dare to explore them. Now that your powers are stirring, you must not sleep without protection, or you leave yourself open to attacks from the duat, or unintended journeys through it. The headrest is enchanted to keep your consciousness anchored to your body. You mean I actually did? My mouth tasted like metal. Could he have killed me? Amos's expression was grave. The fact that your soul can travel like that means you are progressing faster than I thought. Faster than should be possible. If the Red Lord had noticed you... The Red Lord, Sadie said. That's the fiery bloke? Amos rose. I must find out more. We can't simply wait for him to find you. And if he releases a storm on his birthday at the height of his powers... You mean you're going to Phoenix? I could barely get the words out. Amos, that fiery man defeated Dad like his magic was a joke. Now he's got demons and he's getting stronger and you'll be killed. Amos gave me a dry smile, like he'd already weighed the dangers and didn't need a reminder. His expression reminded me painfully of Dad's. Don't count your uncle out so quickly, Carter. I've got some magic of my own. Besides, I must see what is happening for myself if we're going to have any chance at saving your father and stopping the Red Lord. I'll be quick and careful. Just stay here. Muffin will guard you. I blinked. The cat will guard us? You can't just leave us here. What about our training? When I return, Amos promised. Don't worry. The mansion is protected. Just do not leave. Do not be tricked into opening the door for anyone. And whatever happens, do not go into the library. I absolutely forbid it. I will be back by sunset. Before we could protest, Amos walked calmly to the edge of the terrace and jumped. No! Sadie screamed. We ran to the railing and looked over. Below was a 100-foot drop into the East River. There was no sign of Amos. He'd simply vanished. Philip of Macedonia splashed in his pool. Muffin jumped onto the railing and insisted we pet her. We were alone in a strange mansion with a baboon, a crocodile, and a weird cat. And apparently, the entire world was in danger. I looked at Sadie. What do we do now? She crossed her arms. Well, that's obvious, isn't it? We explored the library.